The Young and the Restless spoilers. Nick couldn't breathe when the paused frame on the dashcam froze the face of the man who had stepped into Noah's headlights. The image was grainy, distorted by the rain, but the jawline, the stance, the cold glint in those eyes, there was no mistaking them. J.T. Hellstrom. For a long moment, neither Nick nor Sharon spoke. The air between them thickened with the weight of recognition and dread. The years melted away, and with them came the ghosts they had tried to bury, literally. J.T. Hellstrom had been dead. They had all believed it. Sharon herself had seen his motionless body and, in her panic and fear, had buried him beneath the dirt of crimson lights. He had clawed his way out of that grave once, but after that night, after the confrontation and the fire, there had been silence. Everyone had assumed the nightmare was over. And yet, here he was, standing in front of Noah's car on the night of the crash. Nick felt a rush of nausea, his hands clenching into fists as old anger surged back with the clarity of a wound reopening. "It's him," he muttered, voice shaking. "It's J.T." Sharon's knees nearly gave out. She remembered the terror of that night, the way J.T.'s rage had burned like a sickness, the look in his eyes when he realized they weren't afraid enough of him. "It can't be," she whispered, but she knew it was. J.T. Hellstrom was alive, and now he had targeted her son. But why Noah? Why now? J.T.'s hatred had always been aimed at Victor, at the Newman family legacy, at Victoria for the life she reclaimed after his madness. Yet if he was back, if he had watched from the shadows all these years, then perhaps Noah had simply been collateral, a message sent through pain. The detectives confirmed nothing officially, but Nick could see it in their faces. They recognized the name too. J.T.'s history was one of obsession and decay. Once a hero, a man with honor and integrity, his life had collapsed into paranoia and violence. He had blamed Victor for destroying his career, his family, his sanity. His relationship with Victoria had ended in tragedy, and his descent afterward was both terrifying and pitiful. When the Newmans thought they had killed him in self-defense, the guilt nearly tore their family apart. But for J.T., survival had only deepened his madness. He had become a phantom of vengeance, nursing his grudge in silence, shaping it into something cold and calculated. Nick's mind raced. If J.T. had resurfaced, that meant he had a plan, something deliberate, something meant to hurt all of them where it mattered most. Sharon clutched his arm, her voice trembling. "He's not the same," she said. "He can't be. He's changed." Nick shook his head. "No. He's worse. You don't crawl out of a grave and come back sane." The question that haunted them both was where he had been hiding all these years. The man in the dashcam looked older, his face leaner, his expression carved by time and bitterness. It was possible he had altered his appearance, undergone surgery, hidden under another name. But that glare, that was pure J.T. Somewhere in Los Angeles, the ripples of his return were already being felt. Rumors circulated quietly through back channels. A man matching J.T.'s description had been spotted near the Nightlight Club 2 nights before the crash. Nick remembered Sienna mentioning a call to Noah that night, a call she claimed was about something trivial. What if J.T. had used her, manipulated her, or worse, what if she had been working with him? The idea sent chills down Nick's spine. He knew how charming J.T. could be when he wanted something, how easily he could draw people into his delusions. But one name kept resurfacing in Nick's thoughts: Reed. J.T.'s son. Reed Hellstrom had once been a bright, sensitive young man torn between loyalty to his mother, Victoria, and the confusing shadow of his father's legacy. If J.T. was alive, had he found Reed? Was Reed in Los Angeles now, unaware that his father was hunting the family that had once tried to save them both? The thought was unbearable. Nick had always cared for Reed like a nephew, and the idea of him being dragged into this chaos again filled him with dread. He imagined J.T. whispering poison into Reed's ear, twisting his sense of justice into hatred, convincing him that the Newmans had destroyed their lives. Sharon, still trembling, whispered the question Nick couldn't answer: "What if he's been watching us all this time?" It wasn't impossible. JT had been an investigator once, skilled at surveillance and strategy. If he had planned Noah's crash, then he had access to their routines, their weaknesses. He knew where to strike to inflict maximum pain. Sharon remembered the claustrophobic terror of those weeks when she thought he was dead, only to see him alive, stalking them through shadows. The thought that it was happening again made her stomach turn. Nick went back to the footage, forcing himself to watch every frame. The man in the rain didn't run when the headlights hit him, he stood there, motionless, daring the car to collide. It wasn't an ambush, it was a statement. He wanted Noah to see him. He wanted the Newmans to know he was back. And then he vanished into the storm, leaving chaos behind. Why Noah? Nick whispered again. Maybe Noah had stumbled upon something, an account, a message, a piece of information JT needed to keep buried. Maybe it was random cruelty. Or maybe, in JT's warped mind, punishing Noah was the same as punishing Victor. After all, in JT's eyes, every Newman was an extension of the man he despised. The detectives began tracing old connections, JT's former allies, hospital records, possible aliases. Nothing concrete yet, but whispers emerged of a man fitting his description spotted in Nevada, then in California. Nick knew he couldn't wait for bureaucracy to catch up. He would find JT himself. He owed that to Noah, to Sharon, to Victoria, and to everyone who had ever suffered because of that man's rage. Meanwhile, Sharon couldn't stop replaying the night they buried him. The sound of dirt hitting the earth, the suffocating guilt, the weeks of nightmares. She had tried to make peace with it, to believe that she had survived something too awful to relive. But now, all of that came rushing back. The image of JT clawing his way out of that grave was no longer metaphor, it was memory returning to life. And now he was out there again, somewhere in the sprawl of Los Angeles, wearing a different face but the same hatred. Back at the hospital, Claire and Holden stood quietly outside Noah's room as Sharon wept softly by her son's side. Neither of them knew the name JT Hellstrom, not yet, but they could feel the tension building in every corner of the Newman family. Nick entered moments later, his face pale, his voice low. "It's him," he said simply. "It's JT." The name meant nothing to them, but the look in his eyes did. It was the look of a man who had seen the past rise from the grave. Whether Reed was in Los Angeles or not remained uncertain, but one thing was clear, the sins of the past were circling back, and JT Hellstrom was not finished with any of them. The years might have changed his appearance, but hatred, especially the kind born in the dark corners of obsession, never fades. It festers. And now it was alive again, standing in the rain on a deserted road, staring straight into the headlights of the next generation of Newmans, reminding them all that some enemies never die. The rumors spread through Genoa City and beyond like wildfire, whispered in the back rooms of clubs, murmured over morning coffee, and pushed into the anxious scrolls of social feeds, that Reed Hellstrom had been with his father, that the son who had once seemed so fragile had sought refuge beside the only man he had ever truly trusted. For those who remembered Reed as a kind, confused young man, the image of him sheltering a father who had driven so many of their lives to the edge was almost unbearable. For Reed himself, the feelings were muddled and complex, a tangle of loyalty, admiration, and the warped love that can grow between a boy and a father whose reality is broken. If Reed truly was with JT, it made JT untouchable in Reed's eyes, a sacred, inviolable figure whom no one could or should ever punish, and that dangerous, naive devotion made any attempt at reason or vengeance far more difficult. But the truth clawed at the edges of every rumor, vengeance never heals, and Reed, if he was out there under the sway of his father, needed to wake up to the fact that hatred would only continue to poison them both. The community's pleas tumbled into one another. "Reed, wake up, stop defending what has become monstrous," and even the steeled Newmans found themselves pleading for mercy in whispers, because pleading was all that remained when the law could not move as fast as fear. Nick felt the gravity of that rumor like a physical weight pressing on his chest. If JT had indeed convinced Reed to shelter him, to help him hide or to cover his tracks, then the calculus of this revenge shifted from a desperate hunt for a lonely madman to a dangerous family matter that could consume more lives. He imagined Reed young, impressionable, and still capable of goodness, listening to JT's distorted tales about right and wrong, hearing claims that the Newmans had ruined them and that only retribution could set things right. It filled Nick with a kind of sorrow that was sharper than anger. Reed had been a child who trusted, who loved, and now he might be pulled into the darkest corner of a man who had become a living symbol of their worst night. The idea of Reed standing by a man who had terrified them all made Nick's hands go cold. He wanted to run, to find Reed and shake sense into him, to show him that the man he loved had long ago been consumed by obsession and that loving him now was only burning Reed's life down with his father's own flames. But before any of that, the practical world of rescue and protection demanded action. With JT's face identified on the dashcam and the already fragile notion of safety shattered for the Newman family, the first priority was to shield Noah and those closest to him. Sharon, who had carried nightmares of JT for years, moved with a quiet ferocity that surprised even herself. A woman who had once buried a man out of terror now found her grief transformed into relentless defense. She and Nick met with detectives, private security consultants, family lawyers, and anyone who could add a single layer of protection. The hospital increased guarded patrols, plainclothes officers were stationed in the corridors, and every visitor was logged meticulously. Nick personally arranged for a rotation of private security, discreet, watchful former officers who could blend into the background but would respond with speed and force if JT tried to strike again. He also contacted trusted family friends in Los Angeles, people who knew the city's underbelly and who could be mobilized at a moment's notice. Privacy fences went up around Sharon and Nick's home while surveillance vans, paid for by a family that knew the price of secrets, rolled to strategic corners. The message was simple and brutal: you cannot touch my family again. At the same time, the police followed every possible lead to locate JT. They tracked sightings out of Nevada, old checks that surfaced under different names, and grainy CCTV that matched gait and posture to the image in the dashcam. JT, if he was alive and mobile, was not a man who wanted to be seen, and yet, as the detectives pointed out, his need to be noticed, to make a statement, had always been a driving force in his violence. He wanted them to know he was there, he wanted them to feel his rage. The investigators hypothesized plausible hiding places: a cheap motel in the outskirts of LA where a man could fade into the listless night, a remote trailer park where people moved like ghosts, an abandoned warehouse repurposed as a living shadow. One veteran detective even suggested the mountainous routes north of the city, places with forgotten cabins and deep tree lines where a man with a past could teach himself new names and new ways to last. But JT's cunning gave them fits. He had once been an investigator, learned how to cover tracks, how to use the small kindnesses of strangers to buy concealment. The game became a chess match fought in static-filled radio communications and at surveillance monitors where officers watched and waited for the wrong move. Reed's possible presence in Los Angeles injected a human urgency into the operation. Nick reached out to Victoria with a heaviness in his voice that bypassed careful phrasing. Reed was not just a name and a rumor to him. He was someone they had once welcomed like family. Victoria, among the most composed and politically sharp of the Newman clan, felt her own fear slice through the polish. She dispatched discreet inquiries through legal channels and sent friends and former employees to quietly check the areas around Sienna's club, the Night Light, because the rumor that JT had been spotted near that club could also mean he'd used it as a staging ground. If Reed was with his father, he might be there, too, believing JT's lies or simply too loyal to question them. Victoria's people also combed through Reed's recent social activity, bank drops, and any travel signs. Reed might be attempting to survive in the dark, or he might be hiding voluntarily, convinced he was protecting his father from a world that had wronged them. Either scenario was a catastrophic mistake that needed correction. Across the ocean of concern, Sharon refused to be idle. She began writing letters to Reed in the only way she could imagine reaching him, making her words soft yet direct. Reed, remember who you were before this. She recalled to herself the boy who loved reading and made clumsy jokes, the boy who cried when he first learned the world could be cruel. She pressed those memories into the letters as if they could survive dog-eared paper in midnight despair. Those around her, incredulous at first, soon offered help, mutual friends of Reed's who still cared, people who had moved on from JT's shadow but who might be able to tap into Reed's forgotten loyalty to goodness. Sharon's hope was not naive, it was a strategic tenderness aimed to pull Reed back from the brink before JT rewired him irrevocably. The emotional stakes soared when a new piece of intelligence arrived, a grainy image from a private traffic camera placed outside a low-profile motel in a border town 3 hours north of Los Angeles. The photos showed a man with a hunched gait and a battered coat entering with a duffel bag. It was not definitive JT, but the timing, the route, and the way the man avoided eye contact suggested a pattern consistent with previous sightings. The investigators pounced, trying to trace credit card transactions, phone pings, and motel logs. But JT, who had learned to live like a ghost, had also learned to avoid the conveniences that left a trail. Every blocked lead only hardened the family's resolve and increased the intensity of surveillance. No detail was too small: the license plate of a supporting vehicle, a name on a guest register, a delivery drop noted in security footage. Meanwhile, the human anatomy of fear shaped the Newman daily life into something defensive and predictable. They stopped driving the same routes. They changed schedules. Nick refused to let Noah sit alone while he slept. Sharon kept vigil in shifts. The hospital room where Noah lay, though secure, felt like a fragile bubble ready to burst with the wrong knock at the wrong hour. Visitors were screened carefully, invitations were vetted, and everyone moved with the slow rhythm of people waiting for an aftershock. Friends tried to offer normalcy, calls, casseroles, television reruns, but the shadow of JT stretched over every courtesy. Sienna's involvement, still murky and stubbornly evasive, remained a piece of the puzzle that threatened to connect disparate threads: the nightlight club, the call to Noah the night of the crash, the possible sightings of a man with JT's features nearby. Nick's suspicion of Sienna shifted his priorities. She might be an unwitting pawn, manipulated by JT's seductive cunning, or she might be something else, a liaison, an enabler, or even a conduit to places JT could no longer access alone. Holden, Kyle, and Claire found themselves entangled in the investigation beyond casual curiosity. They were witnesses in the life of a son who lay wounded, and they grew invested in his safe return. When Holden confronted Sienna again in the dim back room of the nightlight club, he pressed until something gave: a tear, a slip, a confession. She admitted she had seen a man that night and that she'd called Noah in a panic, but she insisted she had not arranged the crash. That claim was small comfort. The police kept watch on her movements, ran forensic checks on her phone, and used her as a vector to map JT's potential network. Yet for all the strategic scrambles, the raw human cry rang clearest: where is JT? The question became a chorus in the Newman household and in the quieter corners of Genoa City. The answer was not simple. It required patience the family did not have and time that felt lethal. The detective in charge, a weary man who had seen cycles like this break into tragedy or justice, leaned on resources in both cities and pumped the case through federal channels because a man with JT's history was no local footnote. He was a threat with a long shadow. The federal investigators, drawn in because JT's movements crossed state lines and because the dashcam image constituted evidence of an intentional act, added pressure and breadth to the search. Wiretaps, warrants, and subpoenas followed like shadows themselves, and the maze of a man's past unfolded under the bright, clinical light of law enforcement. As this machinery hummed, the personal plea remained the thing that burned hottest: protect Noah. Protect the family. Bring JT into the light before he can extract more ruin. Nick's private security measures tightened, and he offered himself as a decoy when necessary, positioning himself at the hospital at hours when JT's cruelty might calculate a hit. It was dangerous and reckless, but fury has its own logic. He was willing to trade his safety for his son's chance at waking into a world that still had love in it. Sharon, meanwhile, mobilized emotional allies, people whose influence might sway Reed if Reed was indeed still under his father's spell. Phone calls were made in the quiet dark, old teachers, pastors, even distant relatives who once loved Reed and who might be able to reach him through memories JT could not overwrite. The city waited, poised on a knife's edge between dread and the promise of exposure. And then, in the way stories of this kind tend to gather, a new whisper fed the fire, an anonymous tip that JT had been seen at a desert rest stop farther north, his face hidden beneath a cap, moving with that same stubborn defiance that had brought him through the grave years ago. The tip was vague, an unreliable thread at best, but if there was one truth the Newmans had learned over the years, it was this. Rumors are the first breath of real danger. They must be followed, tracked, and answered with action. So they moved. Surveillance vans rolled toward the desert highway. Officers fanned out in unmarked cars. Reed's known acquaintances were contacted, offered protection and reassurances that there was a life to choose other than the one his father offered. In the hospital, Noah shifted in his sleep, fingers twitching as if in response to some approaching storm. Sharon bent over him, murmuring the same plea that had become a prayer for every worried parent, "Wake up. Come back to us."